We asked residents whether they feel race relations in the United States are generally good or generally bad. While the majority of both Black and white residents feel U.S. race relations are generally bad, more than 80% of Black residents feel they are generally bad, compared to less than 70% of white residents. Overall, Black and white residents agree race relations are getting worse, but a larger share of white residents are more likely to think they are improving relative to Black residents. So the same questions with a local focus. And here, Black and white residents feel things are generally good, although white residents are much more likely to feel that way. We note here that Hispanic Latinx residents fall somewhere in between the perceptions of white and Black residents. Are race relations improving? White residents are more likely to think so, although a majority of both Black and white residents feel things are staying the same. We asked a series of questions asking residents the extent to which issues of race or ethnicity shape dialogue in the community and one's own identity. We asked the question, how much attention is being paid to race and racial issues in your community these days? Nearly twice as many Black residents felt too little attention is being paid. We note on this question that Hispanic Latinx residents aligned with the perceptions of white residents. 34% of each group felt too little attention was being paid. This is one of the more significant findings in the survey. Asked the question, how important is your race or ethnicity when it comes to your personal identity? 71% of Black residents feel it is extremely important. While no response captured a majority of white resident sentiment, a plurality of white residents felt their race is not important to their identity. And we note on this question that Hispanic Latinx residents aligned more closely with Black residents. As a plurality, 45%, of this group felt their ethnicity is extremely important to their identity. Asked about the frequency with which friends or family members make racially insensitive comments or jokes, 58%, which is the 44 plus 14, of Black residents said rarely or never, compared to 73%, 40 plus 33, of white residents. 75% of Black residents feel that the expression of racist or racially insensitive views has become more common over the years. White resident perception is equally divided as to more or less common. When asked if it's become more or less acceptable for people to express racist or racially insensitive views in recent years, a majority of white residents feel it has become less acceptable, whereas a plurality, 47%, of Black residents feel it has become more acceptable. And we note on this question that Hispanic Latinx residents aligned more closely with white residents. As a majority, 56% of this group felt expressing these types of views has become less acceptable. We also asked a series of questions regarding the role of racism in society. While Black and white residents alike agree that white supremacist hate groups pose a threat to America, there was a sharp difference, and take a look at the bottom of the chart, regarding the legacy of slavery in the current social and economic position of Black people. There is agreement between Black and white residents in the perception that Black people are treated less fairly by the criminal justice system, but in other areas, the perception of fair treatment was not shared. Black and white residents disagree on the impact of being white on the ability to get ahead. 56% of Black residents feel it helps a lot, in contrast to only 22% of white residents feeling that way. In the case of being Black, 2 in 3 Black residents feel it hurts a lot or a little in getting ahead in our community, compared to 51% of white residents. Here's that same question, as answered by all residents, presented in side-by-side format. In the top bar, we see that 54%, 25 plus 29, of all residents feel that being Black hurts one's ability to get ahead. In the bottom bar, we see that only 14%, 7 and 7, of residents feel that being white has the same impact. For respondents who stated that being Black either hurts a lot or a little, but hurts in some way in getting ahead, large majorities agree that both systemic and individual racism are the leading causes. Finally, we asked some questions about individual experiences with racism. In response to the question, have you personally experienced discrimination or been treated unfairly because of your race or ethnicity? We clearly see a parallel divide between Black and white residents. While 80% of Black residents responded yes to that question, nearly 80% of white residents responded no to that question. And we note here that on this question, Hispanic Latinx resident experiences fell in between the white and Black experiences, that a majority, 60% of these residents have personally experienced discrimination. Among those who said they had experienced racial discrimination, racial slurs or jokes were the most common form for both Black and white residents. Black residents were far more likely to report unfair treatment in hiring or employment, that people treat them as not being smart, and that people acted suspicious of them. I've got a couple summary slides in here. In the interest of time, I'll leave these for you to review at your convenience. I know that was a lot of information to cover in a short time, and I thank you for your attention. The survey results are available at stateoftheregion.com under other resources, and I'll look forward to being part of this discussion today and into the future.
Thank you very much, David, for that informative presentation and really that thorough overview of how residents of the Tampa Bay region view and understand racism today. So clearly, the data suggests that there are significant gaps in terms of how Blacks, whites, and Hispanics of all races perceive racism. And so this gap may be attributed to a number of factors. And one of those reasons may be the difficulties in really recognizing the wide-reaching ways that systemic and individual forms of racism impact communities of color. So in this panel, I am pleased to have the opportunity to connect these broader data trends with insights from people's everyday lives and their lived experiences, in order to really enlighten the community about the very personal ways that systemic racism is felt by our panelists, and in ways that illustrates that systemic racism is real. So with that goal in mind, we are honored to have two guests joining us on this panel. First, we have Mr. Ed Narain, who is a community leader, former member of the Florida House of Representatives representing District 61, and I should mention, former president of the student body at the University of South Florida from 1997 until 1998. We also have joining with us Mr. KJ Sales. KJ is a current University of South Florida student athlete and community activist. So thank you both for joining us here today. So really, without further ado, I want to go ahead and get started so we have ample time to hear both KJ's and Ed's perspectives on the study and on racism more broadly. And so my first question is really to Mr. Ed Narain. And I want to frame this by saying that the data that was just presented shows that Tampa Bay residents view race relations in their own community more positively than they view race relations in the US more broadly. So why do you think people see racism as something outside of themselves and are not able to see it or recognize it within their own communities?
So great question. And first, let me say to everybody involved in asking me to participate in today's Huddle for Change, the first ever, thank you very much for thinking so highly of me to ask me to be here. And yes, I am a proud bull. I am also very proud to be associated with the Tampa Bay Partnership, representing my company on its board. So very proud of the work that the partnership has been doing in this particular area. But what you find is a lot of times people don't believe there's a problem because they're not directly affected by it. Let's take a couple steps back and look back to the civil rights movement. Because when we think about racism in this country, especially for those of us who are under 50 years old, that's the lens in which we're taught to look at racism. So if we don't see people being hosed down in the streets, if we don't see people being attacked by dogs in Kelly Ingram Park, or having to sit down and protest for their basic rights to sit wherever they want in a public place like a bus, we're led to believe that racism is over. And so I think that's the biggest lie that we've kind of told ourselves as a society, that we've moved past the institutional racism that's out there, the very overt versions of it. And because we don't see it every day and it's not happening, it means that it's completely evaporated. And nothing could be further from the truth. Most recently, I think last year when George Floyd was murdered, what that did was that put a mirror up to our country. And when we look back in that mirror, for the first time in a long time, all Americans, we didn't like what we saw because it was raw. And we watch a man get murdered by an institution that's supposed to protect and serve us. And so I think if you took a poll amongst Black Americans, they would tell you, hey, we've been telling you there's an issue with policing in our communities for a long time. Whereas most white Americans, despite what they've seen over the last 7 years with the protests in the streets, would say, oh, no, there's no problem with policing. So that mirror that we had to look at, we saw something that we thought was long gone. And for a lot of Americans, they said, okay, we need to do something. The problem is we didn't know what to do in that moment. So yes, as long as we think that problem is in Minnesota and not Tampa, people are less likely to actually do something to bring about change.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that answer. And I want to ask a follow-up question that I'll also ask
Sure.
to KJ after you. But from your unique position as a community voice, has it gotten easier or harder to talk about racism now in comparison to the past year, for example?
So I will say this. This goes back to what W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, having a dualness, and a two-ness as a Black person in America. I've always had the burden of having to talk about and explain race to my white peers, whether it be in the business world or back when I was serving in government. And it is something that we have to kind of carry with us, African Americans in certain circles, to kind of explain to people who haven't been exposed to African American culture, in particular, in my case, what exactly may be going on or why people may be upset about a particular judicial outcome. So it is something that it's a burden, but it's one that I'm glad to carry, because at least we're conversations like this, those one-on-one conversations that we've seen change start from that. So yes, it is something that lately has become easier to talk about because the groups that want to talk about race will approach you. This forum being put together is great, but I'm going to say this, and I mean this in the nicest of terms. The people who are on this webinar right now who are listening are not the people who need to change their views on race in America. It's our brothers, it's our cousins, it's those who are around us that don't think race is still an issue that need to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer to that. And I want to offer that question also to KJ. KJ, from your perspective, you've actually been pretty vocal. We talked about the fact earlier that you have been on the news and been interviewed in newspapers. How has it gotten easier or harder for you to talk about racism in this moment in comparison to the past? How would you respond to that? I think you might be muted, KJ.
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
I think that it has gotten easier due to the simple fact that, a lot of people are starting to become more open to, the situation. And like I said, this has been going on for decades and centuries. And this is something that needs to be talked about. But, I feel that as if like people really don't understand, some people just really don't understand. And these conversations, have to be brought up in order for people to understand.
Great. And so it sounds like you feel like this is a context where people are actually open to hearing this. I want to pivot a little bit to talking, and this question is for you actually, KJ, to talk a bit about the study in particular, because some folks may have the impression that if you go to college, once
Right.
Black people in particular have an education, once they are a representative, for Florida, for example, in the House, that they no longer have to deal with racism, that they don't have to face racism. From your experience, do you believe that is true? Why or why not? Does your class status or your status related to your occupation allow you to escape racism?
To a certain extent, in my opinion. Once you've went to college, once you're an athlete or, you have your celebrity, that's all good and well until you don't have that anymore. And I feel as if, once you hang up your cleats or once you stop dribbling a basketball or once you graduate from college, it becomes a problem when people don't know who you are or when you're in this unfamiliar area where there isn't anyone that really knows who you are. And so that's when you start to experience, that's when, people like me, LeBron and others start to experience that type of racism.
What's interesting is that there's a whole conversation about athletes not needing to speak about injustice. So the idea is just shut up and dribble or shut up and play. So it's almost as though athletes can get the space to play, but the moment they try to use their position in a way to advance justice, there's been pushback. So it's interesting that you take that position. I want to direct a question to Mr. Narain. One of the interesting findings in the study is that while white residents readily acknowledge racism in policing, they were less likely to say that it exists systemically in education and the financial wealth gaps and job attainment. What do your own experiences lead you to believe about whether or not racism is a systemic problem? You may still be on mute. There you go. I can hear you now.
There we go. Hey, there's nothing wrong with it. Our organizers trying to keep it an orderly room. My own experiences with that. There's a story that I've actually become more comfortable telling lately that I hadn't told for a long time about the first night that I got elected in Tallahassee. And I was there with another member of the legislature. We had a drink at a Hotel Duval. We came downstairs. We ran into a couple other members. One of those members was white. And that white member looked at both of us and he said, "Hey, who do you guys work for?" Now, granted, we were new, right? So somebody would say, "Ed, you're making too much of this." The guy, he shouldn't have known who you were. The problem was the person who asked this question was another member who a week earlier had done our training on how to be members of the House of Representatives in Florida. So this wasn't a simple, mistake. We're both wearing our pins that reflect us as being members of the legislature, but in his mind, he could not see us as actually being members or his equal. We had to be aides. We had to be somebody working for somebody. And it's those type of microaggressions that African Americans and Latinos in this country have to deal with when we're around some of our peers. We're never really seen or accepted, unfortunately, as equals. And you're in this constant state of trying to almost prove yourself and prove your worth. And I will tell you, that's an imposter syndrome type of situation that I would encourage anybody to try, just get rid of it. If you've made it into that room, you have an obligation to yourself and to your community to be the very best and forget about those microaggressions, forget about the racism and what people might be thinking about you. All that matters is you did more than enough. And usually in our cases, way more than enough to be there, and it's time to make an impact.
Great. Thank you for that. KJ, this is a question that in some ways is in line, in some ways with what Mr. Narain just mentioned. There's sometimes an assumption that Black people already know the history and the impact of systemic racism, and it's white people who need to be educated, or it's other folks who need to be educated. From your experience, how do you think these community conversations or a focus on education might benefit members of all racial and ethnic groups?
I'm glad you asked that question because, my goal for the future is to rebuild. And, a lot of people through experience don't really know what, Black people and minorities go through, and a lot of times it starts in the household. And so, me growing up where I grew up, and it creates this environment to where it's a very competitive environment. But, coming from the bottom, it seems like no one cares about you, or no one wants to see you win, or you have all odds against you. And a lot of times, we see these young men, brought up in society today, their minds are gone because they feel like no one cares about them, or no one cares about their place of living, and no one cares about, their schooling and things like that. So I feel as if, rebuilding and educating people on how, these people are living, some of these living situations are just flat out terrible, and it needs to be rebuilt. For example, Central Park Villages, where I grew up, it was the projects, of course, and it's tore down now. It got tore down in 2007, but that was a place of living back in the day for African Americans that was considered, the Black Wall Street of Tampa. And of course, it got torn down because of all the riots. But to see how that project progressed over the years, the living situations wasn't what it used to be. It was infested, it was rats, it was everything like that. So no one had the chance to, no one even thought, oh, let's go over here and let's try to help these people, revamp their life or their situations and things like that. So I think that plays a key part into it.
Right. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that education piece is important for all communities, whether we're talking about Black folks, white folks, Hispanics of all races. Everybody needs to have a clear understanding of the history that's led us to where we are today. And we can't assume that people know that. I know we have a limited amount of time on our panel, and as we wind things down, one of my final questions is actually for Mr. Narain, which is, what do you think we can do as a community to be sure that anti-racism is not just a phase, but instead is really incorporated and embedded into our policies and our practices? And how might conversations like these be useful in that to reach that goal?
Well, obviously, what the community is doing today through all the partnerships that have come together to make this forum happen is one of the first steps that it needs to occur. The other thing I'll share is it's incumbent upon everybody. Going back to the very first question, about why don't we see racism as a local problem or a problem for each of us? We all have to take responsibility in trying to educate those who may not understand truly why people are in the situation that they are in, for example, which is why I love the data that the partnership has just come out with. I mean, if we think about the data, there was some striking things that jumped out at me. I'll give you one of the examples. African Americans make about $4.48 less per hour than white Americans right here in Tampa Bay. Now, we're not talking about Mississippi or Alabama. We're talking about an income gap that's right here. And if you were to resolve that issue, if we were to just wipe a wand over Tampa Bay and make it equitable for Black and brown people, according to the study, you're looking at a $50 billion impact to this community, 50 billion with a B. That's an average of $6,500 per capita income per household. That's how you lift people out of poverty. There's a cycle that has happened. Let's not forget the laws and the systemic racism that put most Black and brown people in the economic situation that we're in today. Those have changed, okay? There's no doubt about it. What needs to continue to change is people's hearts. And so that means if you're serving on a board that's not diverse, you need to speak up and ask about why we don't have more people of color at the table. Same thing for your corporations. Yes, it's good to have entry-level positions that look like the country, but what about your senior leadership? Why don't we have more African American and Latino executives serving on boards and leading corporations? It starts with each of us. And then finally, I'll say it's on our government leaders to make sure that when they're passing policies, they're thinking about all the unintended consequences of those policies and how it might impact people. Thank goodness Florida has raised the minimum wage effective this year, but that minimum wage is only $8.56 an hour. So you do that by 40 hours a week, by 4 weeks in a month, you're talking an average of a little over $16,000 a year for an individual. Guess what? That's only $4,000 above the poverty line for a single person. So we have to look at, how did we get here? Why is it that Black and brown people are only seen to be accepted in certain positions outside of entertainment? So I'm not talking about just music or athletes, but when you think about professionals, why don't we have more Black doctors, more Black attorneys, more Black business people? We have to ask those questions. And then if you are white, you need to patronize those individuals with your services. Because I can tell you this, if you took a poll of most of your professionals and you asked them whether or not people that didn't look like them utilize their services, I don't think you'd be surprised by the answer. The answer is no. So we've got to be intentional about who we give our business to and the policies that we're passing in government. And then those of us who have positions of influencing it, using it to make sure we're diversifying the situations that we find ourselves in, whether it be a board or some sort of government service or some sort of corporate work. Long answer to a very complicated question, I know.
Well, I appreciate your thoughtful response. I think essentially what you're saying is that any of these solutions have to be multidimensional. We have to understand the multidimensional impact of systemic racism. So we're talking about diversity in terms of recruitment, but we're also talking about advancement. We're talking about changing policies and practices. And it really is that type of multi-layered approach that's going to be required. So I'd just like to thank both of you, Mr. KJ Sales, Mr. Ed Narain, for participating on this panel and for really modeling the type of vulnerability with your own personal stories that we hope we'll also see in the break room a little bit later on today. So thank you so much. And I believe that your answers have given us a better sense of understanding of some of the issues that you two individually face, and will hopefully set the stage for future conversations with the broader community about how to address systemic racism. And so with that, I'll pass this back to Tammy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horace Freeman, and I join you in thanking the rest of the panel as well. What I love about your comments this afternoon is that we have the connection of the data to the personal experiences, and then the reminders from our panelists. Mr. Narain, I was hearing you when you were saying that sometimes the people that are coming to these programs are the ones that are kind of the furthest down the road in terms of our journey to racial understanding. And so we have to talk to our family, our cousins, our community members, wherever we find them, and ensure that we're utilizing that history as the foundation for our conversation. So today, we've built out kind of two frameworks for you already. We have the data to support it, and we've started to talk about the history. And so now we're going to build up some skills around being able to have conversations, difficult conversations around race equity from an informed and empowered and confident position. So I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and we're going to take what we've learned now and move into breakout rooms. But before we do that, I'm going to introduce my Community Tampa Bay colleague, Sam Obeid. And Sam's going to walk us through an activity to build the connection and mutual understandings that we need to engage in those difficult and uncomfortable conversations, right? Because we're always looking for safety, but we know we're also going to be uncomfortable. So Sam is Community Tampa Bay's program director. She's a social justice activist by life, and Sam speaks to topics of identity and intersectionality. She prides herself on being a compassionate human invested in the development of both youth and adult advocates. Sam is also an internationally renowned spoken word poet, and believes that open dialogue is the key to bridging gaps between communities. Sam?
Okay, I think you can hear me now, yes? All right, wonderful. So good evening, folks. Thank you all so much for being here. Like Tammy said, I am the program director of Community Tampa Bay. And at Community Tampa Bay, we prioritize the safety of all of our humans before we engage in dialogue. So for this next portion, I'm gonna ask y'all to please use the power of your imagination, all right? You can close your eyes if you have to. And in your mind, I'm gonna ask you to imagine 4 corners of a room, right? So you're imagining 4 corners of a room. Now, each corner has a label. One corner is family, one corner is friends, one corner is school or work, and the last corner is miscellaneous. So you have family, friends, school or work, and miscellaneous. The miscellaneous corner is any group outside of family, friends, school / work. So this could be a church, mosque, temple, synagogue group that you are a part of, or any other religious group that you are part of. It could be a sports club, it could be a book club, any other group that does not fit into these other 3 labels, okay? So you're gonna imagine those 4 corners in your mind. Now my question for you is, in which of these 4 corners do you feel the safest? All right, in which of these 4 corners do you feel the safest? Take a few seconds to pick a corner. Now in the chat box, you are going to type in 1 word as your reason for picking why you feel safest in this corner. So for example, let's say if my corner was friends, if the corner that I feel safest in is friends, then the reason for that would be because that's where I feel like I can be my most authentic self. So my word would be authentic, right? So take a second. We already have some folks responding, which is fantastic. Take a second to figure out why you feel that way and go ahead and type it in the chat box like so many of our lovely humans are already doing. Seeing a lot of the word love is coming up a lot, trust, honesty. There's a lot of energy around acceptance, safety. I'm seeing genuineness, room for mistakes. We have understanding, familiarity, a lot more trust, a lot more safety, a lot more authenticity, lots of love, lots of acceptance. We're seeing listening quite a few times, lots of understanding. I have love, 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 love across the board, choice, unconditional love. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of energy around the words love. We're seeing a lot of energy around the words trust. We're seeing a lot of energy around the words support, right? We're seeing a lot of energy around the words authentic or genuine. Yes, we're seeing a lot of words around, a lot of energy around understanding, listening, faith, to love without fear. Again, support, so much support and so much love, lots of empathy, lots of compassion, right? So we have all of these words. Clearly, there's a lot of energy around feeling safe enough to be authentic and genuine, feeling safe enough to be loved and to feel that love, feeling empathized with, feeling a lot of compassion in spaces, feeling accepted in spaces. Okay, so these are the words that are drawing the most energy among the folks that are here today. Now, when we will be breaking out into small groups shortly, when we do, I'm gonna ask you all to remember these words, because when we're having conversations, especially around race, we want to feel a sense of safety to be able to have those conversations. And if folks have an expectation of love and empathy and support and compassion and authenticity in order for them to feel safe, these are the norms that we are then going to take into those spaces, into those breakout groups, to ensure that we can, in fact, have an open and honest conversation. You can see the words up on the screen for yourself, right? Those are all the words that are drawing most energy from our folks here this evening. And so what we are going to do is, each group, each breakout group that we go into is going to have a designated facilitator, and this designated facilitator is going to lead you through a series of questions around which you'll have the capacity to have a conversation. They will give you further direction as you go into this conversation, right? So our motivation right now is to remember these words as we go into those conversations, because we want everybody here who's participating to feel safe, to feel seen, and to feel heard in everything that they're sharing with us today. Facilitators, please make sure that you reiterate our norms as you lead these conversations. And now, without further ado, let's head out into our breakout rooms. Fam, as you find yourselves waiting in your breakout room, rest assured that your facilitator will meet you there shortly and help guide this conversation through. Folks, whichever group Danielle Jordan is in, could you put me in that group, please?